makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, fell today, almost 20 years after it was originally captured by the US and its local allies, the Northern Alliance, following the invasion of Afghanistan. That was a reaction to 9/11. And there's really no other way of interpreting this as a loss. The war in Afghanistan was a loss for the US. And many people saw it coming. Many people, I guess, just hoped that it would end in a sort of stalemate, that, the Taliban would perhaps control parts of the country, but never really threaten the Afghan government, which was corrupt and incompetent, but somehow they would hold on, and the US would just leave, and there'd still be a mess. The country would still be in chaos in some way or another, but definitely no one imagined, at least in, the foreign policy circles, they did not imagine how swift the Taliban advance would be. And I'm going to show a chart. So that was the situation in Afghanistan just back in May, just a couple of months ago, and you can see that the Taliban controlled certain parts of the country. It was not an inconsiderable amount of territory, and more worryingly was the fact that a large part of the country was contested at the time, which is the slightly lighter orange. And today it's over. It's basically over. Um, I don't think there will be any region in that's still in white in the next couple of days. And even just a couple of days ago, the people weren't were discussing only the possibility that Kabul would fall. Um, just a couple of days ago, the U.S. had announced that it was going to send 3,000 troops to secure an orderly evacuation, and this just went to hell. Just tells you how quickly the Afghan government's forces completely melted away against the Taliban, which at this point I'm sure is mostly armed with US equipment, which was left over or captured from Afghan forces, which were really just probably you could not call them an army. It was a ragtag bunch of people who the US gave the impression that they trained an army, but in practice, they were far from anything resembling a coherent fighting force. And I'm going to get into detail on this. But my question is, could this have been avoided? Could a US occupation of Afghanistan have succeeded? And the answer is we don't really know, obviously. The counterfactual is impossible to really answer. But I think they could have done a better job at it. And I have to say that even though I am, broadly speaking, against US intervention abroad, against forever wars, and against indiscriminate bombing, drone warfare, etc., I do think that in terms of, the legality of attacking and invading Afghanistan, the US, after being attacked during 9/11, did have the case. You know, there was really no objection by the international community in the US responding to 9/11 by invading Afghanistan, which had a government that was essentially harboring the terrorists that committed that act. And we can debate this issue. That I don't want to I don't want to say that this is like a blanket support of an invasion. I'm just saying that legally they probably had a case for it. But then the problem is, what are you going to do after? If you're going to invade and occupy a country, especially one that is basically, has a history of tribalism, history of political chaos, what are you going to do? How are you going to leave it? You can't just go in, defeat the Taliban, capture bin Laden, leave, and then just think that the mission was accomplished. Um, so, in this respect, I do think the US was kind of forced into nation building. Now, could nation building have worked? And the answer is maybe they could have done a better job. And I'm going to show you some of the evidence that could have been the case. So, the first mistake was made shortly after the invasion, when the US and its allies were basically sweeping across the country. And at this time, the Taliban was willing to surrender. And unfortunately, in a massive case of hubris, the US said no. And this would definitely be probably the first and most damning mistake that they could have done. And the sole reason that they rejected a full Taliban surrender was because there was just one condition attached to that, and that was amnesty to Mullah Omar, the guy who had one eye, who was the leader of the Taliban at the time. That was their only condition. And you have to think, how stupid can you be to think, well, you can just keep him in with an armed guard in his house for the rest of his decrepit life. If that's going to get the Taliban to surrender, if that's what's going to get them to cease to exist as an organization, I think it's pretty damn worth it. And here I think there was a lot of historical hubris, this obsession with unconditional surrender that was characteristic of, say, World War II, which in many cases I think would have prevented deaths. Perhaps not so much with the Nazis. I don't think they would have accepted. I don't think it would have been a good idea to accept any sort of remnants of Nazism in Germany. But when it comes to Japan, there was a case to be made because the Japanese were kind of willing to surrender insofar as basically the sovereignty of the emperor was respected. And you could argue that atomic bombings would have been avoided, and maybe perhaps some of the final battles of that conflict may have been avoided if the US had not insisted on an unconditional surrender of Japan. So unconditional surrender sounds good. Sounds like, we kick their ass, we'd completely annihilate it from the face of the planet. But every war has an element of diplomacy in it. And you have to weigh in the benefits of accepting perhaps one tiny concession, like just letting the leader live. That was it. That was the only condition. I think they should have taken it. They should have taken it. But yeah, that was the hubris of the country that was at that moment kicking ass. But then what happened? The Taliban essentially became a guerrilla army. And it took them years to recover their strength. This was not a, one year to another. Afghanistan pretty much was sort of stable for a couple of years until the second half of the 2000s, when problems really started mounting again. Then you had the surge under Obama in 2000. I think it was 2009. It was almost immediately after Obama came to power. And if you take the data on civilian deaths, for example, to weigh in the intensity of the conflict, it really just got worse after 2009. So missed opportunity right there. And the other issue was, what kind of government did the US end up supporting? What government did it create? And there was no better reflection of the kind of incompetence that they put in power than Hamid Karzai. You probably remember him. He was president for a huge amount of time. I think he was almost there a decade or more. I don't remember exactly how much. But this was a guy who, at the time, was lauded as, the savior of Afghanistan. He was a runner-up for Time Person of the Year 2010. And I mean, look at how he's described. There are two schools of thought about Hamid Karzai. First is that he's a vain, incompetent, monumentally corrupt leader with serious mood disorder problems that require medication. Holy shit. How can you continue? Like, after you read this, how can you expect anything positive to be said about him to compensate that description? But yeah, the second is that the president of Afghanistan is a deceptively clever politician who has built a serviceable coalition among Afghanistan's riot of tribes and factions, which requires a certain amount of skill and, shall we say, lubrication, and deft public figure who knows how to balance his dependence on U.S. military against his public's increasing frustration with an endless war. Okay. So everyone basically knew that Karzai and his government was a disaster, a complete disaster. It was a cesspool of corruption. It was a cesspool of incompetence. And it wasn't really even achieving anything that is being described of him here. You know, this sort of coalition, a loose coalition among tribes and factions. The problem is that this coalition was essentially handpicked to be those who were allied with the US or who saw the US occupation in a relatively positive light. It was not an attempt at actually nation building and, putting all the diverse interests of that country and negotiating with them and forming some sort of unity government, which perhaps should have even included the Taliban. Because there is no better way to, solve a problem in a country with such diverse and conflicting set of interests than giving them all the seat at the table and finding ways in which they can negotiate and share power. But that's not what the US did. Anyway, a lot of people just loved Karzai because he was so fashionable. You had articles like this one from The Independent: fashion icon to the world. Kindred spirits hail from the strangest of corners. Tom Ford, also known as Mr. Fashion, took the opportunity at his latest menswear show for Gucci in Milan to label the newly appointed Afghan leader, Hamid Karzai, quote, the most chic man in the world. Why do they do this? Why do they do this? Yeah, there was a lot of this. One London paper dubbed Karzai the most unlikely style icon since Mahatma Gandhi. Cool. So they loved him because, and this is the biggest flaw of Westerners, they loved him because he was westernized to some extent. And time after time after time, you will always get some of the most horrible people on planet Earth. But just because they were educated at Oxford or Harvard, or just because they have a Western wife, or just because they claim to be reformist and they're going to be open to, Western businesses, whenever they give that spiel, that should immediately ring alarm bells. Because at that moment, Western leaders just start fawning over them. And there is, at that point, there's just no further analysis on whether these people are actually working in the interest of their own people, which really was the key missing strategy in the US's occupation of Afghanistan, in its nation building. It was never about the Afghan people. It was about US national security interests and how to best further them. And it never dawned on them, because it never does, that their national security interest could possibly be opposed to the interest of the Afghan people. And time after time again, this is why these kind of operations fail. It's not because intervention is in itself bad. My position on US intervention abroad is similar to my position on the death penalty. I'm not morally opposed to the death penalty. I think people should deserve to die for the crimes they commit. My problem is, I will not support a policy like the death penalty when judicial systems are imperfect and it could lead to innocent people dying. So just by that logic alone, I am not in favor of the death penalty and never will be. The same with intervention. interventions could lead to good things. The problem is when they're executed under these type of perverse incentives, then you have problems, and that's why they never end up achieving their objectives. So, there's just no way around this. You can think of a few cases where interventions have probably achieved at least some good intentions. The interventions, for example, in Bosnia, when there was pretty much ethnic cleansing being committed. Yeah, that one was okay. You could argue that, for example, the West should have intervened in Rwanda to prevent a genocide. But in almost all these other cases, and especially the only reason that the Yugoslavia interventions kind of worked was because they were in Europe, and there was a different mentality among NATO in dealing with a country like that and the people like the Serbs. But when you start having these interventions somewhere else in the world, where it's a different culture, it's a different religion, it's a different type of social organization, that's when these things stop mattering. And only the national security interest becomes important. But anyway, so just to show the extent of the failure that could have been foreseen, there was a really good series of reporting in the Washington Post. I must confess, I'm not a big fan of the Washington Post, but hey, props when they actually do good journalism. And this was one of them. These were the Afghan Papers, and they were published in 2019. And they showed a massive, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy, but it kind of is. It kind of was a conspiracy. It was essentially a very deliberate web of lies by US officials in trying to present the Afghan war as not being the catastrophe that it was, and that they knew it was. Like long before these issues, these latest problems arose. So they knew it was a disaster. They knew it was pretty much unwinnable. And did they change their strategy? No, they never did. And I'm going to put a link to, there's various, so part of the same reporting, but there's various links. But yeah, basically it was, we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. If the American people knew the mandate of this dysfunction, 2,400 lives lost. Yeah. So look at this. $1 trillion was spent. And that does not include some like CIA money, etc. But yeah, the documents contradict a long chorus of public statements from US presidents, military commanders, and diplomats who assured Americans year after year that they were making progress in Afghanistan and that the war was worth fighting. Several of those interviewed described explicit and sustained efforts by the US government to deliberately mislead the public. They said it was common at military headquarters in Kabul and at the White House to distort statistics to make it appear the US was winning the war when that was not the case. Every data point was altered to present the best picture possible. Surveys, for example, were totally unreliable but reinforced that everything we were doing was right and that we became a self-licking ice cream cone. That's a brilliant. I've never seen that analogy used, but that is so good. Yeah. So it was all like when you see this and you think, oh my God, how did this just happen out of the blue? Well, no, it wasn't out of the blue. This was ongoing. It was the tipping point of a crisis that was in the making for years, and that it was deliberately whitewashed. The history of military conflict in Afghanistan has been one of initial success followed by long years of floundering and ultimate failure. We're not going to repeat that mistake. Cool. Yeah. By the way, I have to say, as someone who has friends who served in Afghanistan, every sort of criticism of American foreign policy is more than welcome, and you should do it. but don't take it out on people who served there. A lot of these people were kids who enlisted in the armed forces in, either during the war or before the war. A lot of kids in the US joined the military to get university scholarships, things like that. And this is how it ended for a lot of them. So, whatever you do, whatever your criticism of the US's forever wars or foreign policy in general, do not take it against the people who served. Just don't. Yeah, there we go. President Karzai. Oh, this is a good one. This army and the police force have been very, very effective in combat against the insurgents every single day. And I think that's an important story to be told across the board. Yeah, this army and police force that basically just melted in a matter of months. Completely melted. So, yeah. One unidentified US soldier said special forces teams hated the Afghan police who they trained and worked with, calling them awful, the bottom of the barrel in the country that is already at the bottom of the barrel. US military officer estimated that 1/3 of police recruits were drug addicts or Taliban. Yet another called them stealing fools who looted so much fuel from US bases that they perpetually smelled of gasoline. Thinking we could build a military that fast and that well was insane. Yeah. And the other aspect is corruption. The absolutely massive scale of corruption that the US essentially permitted and cooperated in. Yeah. So, again, this was known very well, that gushing time description of Karzai admitted that he was, quote, monumentally corrupt. So we knew this years and years and years ago. And yet, it continued. US officials backed off, looked away, and let the thievery become more entrenched than ever, according to a trove of confidential document interviews. Yeah. In the interviews, key figures in the war said that Washington tolerated the worst offenders, warlords, drug traffickers, defense contractors, because they were allies of the US. Yeah. But they said the US government failed to confront a more distressing reality, that it was responsible for fueling the corruption by doling out vast sums of money with limited foresight or regard for the consequences. US officials were so desperate to have the alcoholics to the table, we kept pouring drinks, not knowing or considering we were killing them. Yeah, the scale of corruption was the unintended result of swamping the war zone with far more aid and defense contracts that impoverished Afghanistan could absorb. There was so much excess financed by American taxpayers that opportunities for bribery and fraud became almost limitless, according to the interviews. Now, here is where I don't extend much generosity to the Washington Post in saying that this was the unintended result. The defense contracts were certainly not unintended in any sort of way. Okay, that was deliberate. Although all that money that was funneled into Afghanistan served a commercial purpose in propping up these defense companies. And this is why this whole thing just was doomed from the start. And it goes back to the analogy that I gave to the, my support of the death penalty, morally. Interventions with a country like the US that is so captured by commercial interests, making money for its defense industry. There is no hope that anything that the US does will not be subject to those incentives. And that is why, I repeat, there may have been some chance that nation building in Afghanistan would have succeeded if the interests of the Afghan people had been put ahead of the national security interests of the US and the commercial interests of the US defense industry. But that never happens when the US invades anywhere. And where, not just where it invades, when it intends to stay, because that's really where the money is. So, yeah, this was not unintended in any way. And that's why you have this whole circle of, the people who are, aside from Afghans who now are going back into living under the Taliban, the people who most regret the situation right now, the loss, is everyone in that ecosystem. all those defense contractors, all those think tanks, transatlantic national security think tanks, all those freaking foreign policy ghouls that always appear on all the major networks in the US, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. They're always there. That's how they make money. They're essentially lobbyists. That's the industry that, as of today, lost their job. Because now they can't go on air year after year talking about, giving excuses for why the US needs to stay there. That's the people who right now are lamenting the state of affairs more than anyone else in the US. A lot of them, by the way, neocons who, after the Bush administration ended, kind of jumped ship into like the liberal media. Neocons and traditional conservatives were basically hawks for the whole war on terror, all these forever wars. I'm talking about the Bret Stephens, the Jennifer Rubins, who now, for example, Jennifer Rubin, who is absolutely despicable, who now writes for the Washington Post. Yeah. The Bill Kristols, those guys. Those are the people who inexplicably the liberal media has embraced as their foreign policy experts since they were kind of shamed after the Bush administration ended. So, yeah, that's the story. Kurt Berholop, a forensic accountant who served on a military task force in Afghanistan during the height of the war, said he helped analyze 3,000 Defense Department contracts worth $106 billion to see who was benefiting. The conclusion, about 40% of the money ended up in the pockets of insurgents, criminal syndicates, or corrupt Afghan officials. And it was often a higher percent. Yeah. So, yeah, if you're really interested, like I said, I have a lot of criticism of the Washington Post, but this piece of journalism I thought was really good. And yeah, it was a tragedy in the making. This should have not been a surprise to anyone. I see a lot of people now trying to pin this on Trump's supposed deal with the Taliban and leaving Biden with no answer. That is bullshit. That is bullshit. They're all complicit. They're all complicit. From Bush and the neocons, Islamophobic, racist neocons who started that war, and rather not just started that war, which, like I said, may be justified in light of 9/11, but who framed it in a broader narrative of the war on terror, which included the even more disastrous Iraq War. Those people who started it, but also the liberal centrists who continued it, because the peak of the Afghanistan war happened under Obama. It did not happen under Bush. The majority of troops that fought in Afghanistan fought under the Obama administration. So let's not pretend that Democrats and liberal centrists are free of sin in this outcome. They're not. And then Trump, and then Biden. And I'm sure Biden is going to get, well, to be honest, I can't really assure it, but I suspect that the polls will not be kind to Biden in the next couple of months, because Americans don't like to learn that they lost the war. And even if it wasn't strictly Biden's fault, which I don't think it is, yeah, he's going to inherit all the bad decisions of others. But also, this happened under this situation here happened under Biden's watch. So he does share some of the blame in not having a better plan for withdrawal. But I still think the main guilty parties here are Bush and Obama. So, enough of Afghanistan. I really feel, I truly hope, I'm going to be very, very honest about this. I really hope that the Taliban becomes a milder version of what it was, because life in Afghanistan under the Taliban was fucking horrible, especially for women. But for anyone who wasn't a total religious zealot, it was a horrible life. It was a horrible regime. And I know there are people who will gloat that the US lost this war, and I must confess I am one of them, because bad foreign policy mistakes deserve to be criticized, and we deserve, leftists deserve, people who were anti-war deserve this moment to say we told you so. But that does not escape the reality that things could look pretty bad for people in that country over the next few years. So I truly hope that the Taliban does not become as repressive as it was before. I hope they try and work out some sort of unity government or something. I don't know. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with, the tribal politics of Afghanistan to give an intelligent opinion on this. I just hope we don't return to that very dark period, those 5 years of Taliban rule, for the sake of the Afghan people. But this war was lost years ago. Anyway, on that note, if you like this video, please like, please share. More importantly, please subscribe. And I'll see you next time.